The ground is bone-dry and flat in every direction. Before dawn, in the dark hours before the Australian desert decides to become hot, the air smells of red dust and oxidizer, a sharp chemical smell that sits at the back of your throat and does not leave. The men have been here since midnight. The structure stands 60 feet high on its launch platform, white-painted, slender, fins at the base, the diameter of a London double-decker bus at its widest point. 2 Rolls-Royce engines in the base section, fed by liquid oxygen chilled to -183 degrees Celsius. Fuel so cold the steel around it weeps condensation even in desert air. A man in a white coat marks something on a clipboard. He does not look up at the rocket. He has seen it before. He checks a gauge, he marks again. He walks away. The countdown begins. At Woomera, in the South Australian desert, on a morning that will not make any newspaper in Britain, the most reliable rocket the United Kingdom ever built prepares to fly. It has never been used as a weapon. It never will be. In April 1960, Blue Streak was the most technically advanced ballistic missile program in the United Kingdom's history. It had consumed £62 million of public money, the equivalent of more than $1.5 billion today. It had been engineered by de Havilland propellers at Stevenage in Hertfordshire, powered by Rolls-Royce engines built at Anstey in Coventry, and test-fired at a range in Cumberland, so remote that the nearest town was 8 miles of moorland away. By every engineering measure available at the time, it worked. No other British weapons program of the post-war era had achieved so much, so reliably, at such range. It was faster than anything the Royal Air Force flew. It could deliver a thermonuclear warhead to Moscow from a standing start in less than 12 minutes. That was the peak. Today, no Blue Streak missile protects a single British city. Not one was ever placed on operational alert. The silos that were planned for the English countryside were never dug. The nuclear warheads that were designed for its nose cone were never fitted. The last Blue Streak airframe to fly did so from a desert range in South Australia in 1970, carrying a scientific payload for a European consortium that no longer exists. The rocket that Britain built as its independent nuclear deterrent ended its working life launching experimental satellites for a committee that subsequently dissolved itself and handed its program to France. The engineers at Stevenage and Anstey believed they had built something that could not be argued with. A machine that answered the hardest question of the Cold War with precision engineering and Rolls-Royce reliability. They were correct. The rocket flew. It continued to fly, long after the reason it was built had been taken away from it. What did not survive was not the engineering. What did not survive was the political will to understand what the engineering made possible. The question this episode investigates is not why Blue Streak failed. It is why a machine that never failed was cancelled. Twice. This is not a memorial. A memorial implies a natural end, a life fully lived, a death on the machine's own terms. Blue Streak did not die on its own terms. It died on a cabinet minister's terms, in a committee room in Whitehall, on a morning when the engineers were not invited. What follows is the forensic record, the design documents, the test data, the cabinet minutes, and the testimony of the men who built it. And at the end, a verdict. If you want more stories like this, British machines that worked, that proved themselves, and were cancelled regardless, subscribe. We are building an archive of what Britain built, what it could do, and what ended it. This is British Iron. The specification that created Blue Streak was written in 1955. Its official designation was Operational Requirement OR LUM 39, and it was issued by the Air Ministry in London to answer a question that no British government had ever previously needed to answer. How does a medium-sized island nation in the North Atlantic maintain the ability to destroy a target in the Soviet Union without relying on the United States Air Force to do it? The answer, in 1955, was a ballistic missile, not a bomber. Bombers could be intercepted. Not a submarine-launched system. That technology did not yet exist in British hands. A land-based, liquid-fueled ballistic missile fired from hardened underground silos. capable of carrying a thermonuclear warhead approximately 20,500 miles to target at speeds no interceptor aircraft could match. The engineering decision at the heart of Blue Streak was this. The missile would be stored vertically in a reinforced concrete silo, already fueled, ready to fire within 15 minutes of receiving the order. The silo would be hardened against conventional attack. The logic was straightforward. If the Soviet Union launched a first strike against Britain, the silos would survive. The missiles would then launch. That threat of guaranteed retaliation, was the deterrent. The missiles did not need to be mobile. They needed to be indestructible. That was the design choice. It was made in good faith. In 1955, it was the correct choice. De Havilland. Propellers at Stevenage drew the airframe. Rolls-Royce at Anstey, Coventry, developed the engines under license from the American Rocketdyne Company, a technology transfer that gave British engineers direct access to the most advanced liquid propellant rocket technology then in existence. The test firing facility was established at Spadedam on the Cumbrian moorland, isolated enough to be safe, connected enough to be supplied. By 1957, ground tests were underway. By 1959, the Blue Streak program employed more than 12,000 people across its principal contractors. De Havilland at Stevenage had expanded its guided weapons division specifically for the program. Rolls-Royce had constructed new test facilities at Anstey dedicated to the RZ. Two-engine, the British variant of the American Rocketdyne S-3D, producing 137,000 pounds of thrust per unit, 2 units per missile, igniting simultaneously in a controlled explosion of liquid oxygen and kerosene that could be heard across the full width of Cumberland on a still morning. At Spadedam, 23 engine test firings were completed between 1956 and 1960. The results exceeded specification. The RZ-2 performed reliably. The propellant handling system, one of the most demanding engineering problems in the entire program, given that liquid oxygen must be maintained at extreme cold until the moment of ignition, functioned without catastrophic failure throughout the test sequence. The missile itself reached a confirmed range of 2,500 miles in testing, sufficient to cover every significant Soviet target from a launch point in the English Midlands. Its circular error probable, the measure of accuracy that determines how close to its intended target it will land, was within the parameters set by OR 139. The peak year was 1959, 12,000 workers, 23 successful engine tests, a missile that had met every performance requirement its specification demanded. At the Spadedam test site on a cold November morning in 1959, the engines fired on schedule, held thrust for the program duration, and cut off cleanly. The engineers present noted the result in their logbooks and went home for tea. The program was working. Maurian Bedford. Morgan was the son of a colliery worker from Caerphilly in South Wales. He had won a scholarship to Cambridge, where he read mechanical sciences, and had joined the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough directly after graduation. By 1959, he was one of the most respected aerodynamicists in British government service, one of the men who had laid the technical groundwork for what would eventually become Concorde. In April 1960, 3 days after the government announced the cancellation of Blue Streak as a weapons system, the Ministry of Aviation asked Morgan to chair a study group. The question put to him was precise. Could the cancelled missile be repurposed as the first stage of a civilian space launch vehicle? Morgan convened his group within the week. He had his answer within the month. Yes, it could. The propulsion was sound, the airframe was proven, and the engineering knowledge already paid for. The only thing that needed to change was the payload at the top. Morgan had spent 15 years helping to design the machines that Britain should have built. He would spend the next 15 watching them be cancelled before they were finished. He received the CBE in 1961, the year that Blue Streak, on his recommendation, began its second life as a space rocket before that life, too, was taken from it. He had seen it all before. He would see it again. Did you know that? Leave it in the comments. It helps more people find these stories. The Rolls-Royce RZ-2 engine, designed at Anstey and tested at Spadedam, was the most powerful liquid propellant rocket engine British engineers had ever handled. Building it, maintaining it, testing it at full power, learning the precise behavior of liquid oxygen under operational conditions at scale, gave Rolls-Royce and the wider British aerospace community a body of practical knowledge that existed nowhere else in Europe. When the European Launcher Development Organization, LDO, was formally constituted in 1964, with Blue Streak as its first stage, that knowledge formed the engineering foundation of the entire program. The British understood liquid oxygen propellant at scale. The French and Germans and Italians contributing upper stages to the Europa rocket did not yet. Here is the connection that is almost never made. The team at the Centre National d'Études Spatiales in Paris, who designed the HM7 engine, the upper stage engine of the Ariane rocket that eventually replaced Blue Streak and LDO entirely, and which has launched European satellites continuously since 1979, drew directly on ELDO documentation, including British propellant handling procedures developed at Spadedam and Anstey. The rocket that was built to replace Blue Streak was built, in part, using what Blue Streak taught. The student cancelled the teacher, then used the lesson. The decision to base Blue Streak in fixed underground silos was not a failure of imagination. It was the product of rigorous strategic thinking applied to the best intelligence available in the mid-1950s. The doctrine is called second strike deterrence. The logic runs as follows. If your nuclear missiles can survive an enemy's first strike, the enemy knows that any attack on you will result in its own destruction. That knowledge prevents the attack from happening at all. The deterrent functions not by being used, but by being survivable. A missile that could be destroyed on the ground before it launched was not a deterrent. It was a target. A missile that could survive a first strike and still reach Moscow was the only architecture that produced genuine deterrence. Underground, reinforced concrete silos were the engineering answer to that doctrine in 1955. Harden the silo sufficiently, and the missile inside it survives. The logic was sound. The engineering was achievable. The program went forward. In 1955, the Soviet ballistic missile program was real but imprecise. The missiles that existed, and British intelligence, had reasonable visibility of their development through signals intercepts and aerial reconnaissance, were large, inaccurate, and relatively slow to deploy. The prevailing assessment within the Air Ministry was that a well-hardened silo could withstand the blast overpressure produced by any Soviet missile then in development or foreseeable development within the program's deployment window. The alternatives were worse. Mobile missiles were technically beyond British industrial capacity at that moment. Submarine-launched ballistic missiles required a nuclear-propelled submarine fleet that did not yet exist in British hands and would cost far more than the missile program itself. Aircraft delivered nuclear weapons, the V-bombers, were already vulnerable to improving Soviet air defenses and had a finite operational life. Fixed silos were not the perfect answer. In 1955, they were the only credible answer available to British engineers with British resources and a British budget. The program was the right response to the world as it existed when the specification was written. The world changed between 1955 and 1959. The Soviet R-12 Dvina missile, NATO designation SS-4 Sandal, entered development in 1955 and reached operational testing by 1958. Its circular error, probable, was approximately 2 kilometers at maximum range. That number requires explanation. A circular error, probable of 2 kilometers, means that half of all missiles fired at a given target will land within 2 kilometers of it. Against a city, 2 kilometers is adequate. Against a hardened silo with known coordinates, 2 kilometers is also adequate, because the nuclear warhead carried by the R-12 had a yield sufficient to destroy any structure within that radius. British intelligence was aware of the R-12's progress. By late 1958, the assessment within the Ministry of Defense was clear. Any fixed installation on British soil with a known location, and the locations of missile silos could not be kept secret from Soviet reconnaissance, could be destroyed with high confidence by Soviet missiles already in service. The hardened silo, which had been the engineering answer to the deterrence problem in 1955, had become the strategic liability by 1959. The geometry had not changed. The missile had not changed. The Rolls-Royce engines were still producing 137,000 pounds of thrust on schedule. What had changed was the Soviet targeting capability, and that change had been made not in Stevenage or Anstey, but in Dnipropetrovsk, and it rendered 4 years of British engineering investment strategically worthless overnight. That is the specific irony at the center of this entire story, the characteristic that made Blue Streak the cornerstone of British nuclear deterrence. Its fixed position, its known location, its deep concrete silo, was precisely the characteristic that the Ministry of Defense cited in February 1960 when it confirmed to Cabinet that the program could not proceed. Blue Streak was hardened. Its silos were designed to survive a Soviet first strike. But the silos had fixed coordinates. The coordinates were discoverable, not through espionage alone, but through satellite imagery, through signals analysis, through the basic geometry of a small island nation where construction of large underground structures could not be concealed indefinitely. And once a Soviet planner had the coordinates and a missile with a 2-kilometer circular error probable, the hardened silo stopped being a survival asset and became a pre-targeted grave. The engineers had built exactly what the specification asked for. They had built it to a standard that exceeded OR 1139's requirements. The missile was faster than specified. The engines were more reliable than specified. The range was confirmed at 2,500 miles. The machine had done everything right. What had become wrong was the strategic world it was designed to inhabit. And that change had been made in a Soviet design bureau in Ukraine, not in a British factory in Hertfordshire. Blue Streak worked. That statement requires no qualification. The Rolls-Royce RZ. 2 engines were tested 23 times at Spadedam and performed to specification on every occasion but one, where the failure was in a peripheral system subsequently corrected. The airframe designed at Stevenage was structurally sound. The guidance system met its accuracy requirements. In its second life as the first stage of the Europa launch vehicle within Elduo, Blue Streak completed 9 of 11 launch attempts successfully, a reliability rate of 82%. That compares favorably with any launch vehicle of its era, including American and Soviet equivalents. It was never destroyed by a malfunction of its own making. It never suffered a catastrophic engine failure in flight. The engineers were correct. The machine functioned. That is the engineering verdict. The institutional verdict. Blue Streak was killed twice, first as a weapon, then as a space rocket, by decisions made above the engineering evidence. The first death was the Cabinet decision, confirmed on 13th of April 1960 by Harold Watkinson, Secretary of State for Defense in the House of Commons. The strategic rationale was honest. Fixed-site ballistic missiles could not survive Soviet targeting, and the cost of making them survivable, by converting to a mobile system for which no British technology existed, exceeded any budget the Treasury would sanction. Britain instead accepted the American Skybolt air-launched missile as a replacement. Skybolt was itself cancelled by the United States in December 1962. Britain then accepted Polaris. The independent deterrent became a dependent deterrent. The engineering investment at Stevenage and Anstey was not transferred. It was abandoned. The second death came in April 1973 when Eldo dissolved and the Europa program was terminated. Blue Streak had performed its role within the consortium without failure. The program ended not because the rocket failed, but because the political coalition that funded it could not agree on a governance structure for what came next. The counter-argument that Eldo's structural failures were inevitable given its multinational funding model is legitimate, but it does not alter the central fact. The rocket that was cancelled was not the rocket that had failed. Both deaths were institutional. Neither was engineering. The date is 12th of June 1970. Woomera, South Australia. The pre-dawn temperature is 4 degrees Celsius, cold for a desert, and the stars are still fully visible to the south, the Southern Cross low on the horizon. The launch team has been on site since 2300 the previous night. The Blue Streak first stage has been loaded with liquid oxygen since midnight. The LOX tanker connected to the base section through insulated transfer lines, the oxygen boiling off in small white plumes in the cold air, dissipating immediately in the light easterly wind. The technicians checking the connections wear heavy gloves. Liquid oxygen at -183 degrees Celsius will destroy unprotected skin in under 2 seconds. The rocket stands 60 feet high on Launch Complex 6B. It has been painted white, as all operational Blue Streaks were, to minimize heating from solar radiation during the ascent phase. At the base, the two ARSA-2 engine nozzles are visible between the fins. Each bell-shaped, each about the diameter of a large kitchen table, the interior surface is darkened from previous firings. This is the 9th flight of a Blue Streak first stage in the LDO Europa program. The sequence has been running since 1964. At 0847 local time, the launch controller gives the command. The ignition sequence initiates. Liquid oxygen and kerosene meet in the combustion chambers of both engines simultaneously. The sound arrives before the rocket moves. A deep, sustained crack that crosses the frequency threshold from sound into physical sensation. Something felt through the feet and the chest and the fillings of the teeth. The launcher hold-down bolts release at T+2 seconds after the engines have reached full thrust. The rocket lifts. The two men in the blockhouse watch on the camera feeds. Neither speaks. One is writing in a logbook, the same handwriting from every previous Blue Streak flight in this series. He writes the time of ignition. He writes the thrust reading. He writes nominal. This is what he writes every time. The rocket clears the tower. The Australian desert recedes below it. At maximum dynamic pressure, the point of greatest aerodynamic stress during the ascent, the structure holds as it has always held. The engines continue to burn for approximately 156 seconds. Then they cut off on schedule, and the first stage separates from the French-built second stage above it. In the blockhouse, the logbook records Stage 1 separation nominal. The two men look at each other. One of them knows, because he has read the program review documents, because he knows the European ministers have been meeting, because he understands what the funding gap means, that this is almost certainly the last time. The other man is not certain, but he suspects. Neither says anything. They go back to their instruments. Had you realized what was ending? Leave it in the comments. It matters. The rocket performed perfectly that morning, as it had performed perfectly every morning it was asked to fly. The separation nominal, the burn nominal, the result nominal. The program died the following year. The rocket had nothing to do with it. What disappeared first was the technical knowledge, the engineering expertise accumulated at Spadadam, the specific understanding of large-scale liquid oxygen propellant handling, of ARSI. Two-engine maintenance under operational conditions, of silo hardening and propellant management at scale, existed in the practice of the program. It lived in the hands of the technicians who had loaded propellant in Cumberland and in South Australia. When the program ended, those men dispersed. Some went to British aerospace. Some retired. The knowledge that was not written down was not transferred, because there was nowhere to transfer it to. Britain had no subsequent liquid propellant rocket program for it to flow into. What disappeared second was the craft lineage. The Guided Weapons Division at Stevenage had trained a generation of engineers in ballistic missile design. The apprenticeship program at de Havilland had produced men who understood large rocket structures from the drawing office to the launch pad. When Blue Streak ended, there was no next program. The chain broke. What disappeared third was the capability itself. Britain has not had an independent space launch capability since 1971, when the Black Arrow program, a smaller rocket that drew on some of the same knowledge base, was cancelled 3 months after its only successful orbital launch. The ability to place a British satellite in orbit using a British rocket from a British launch site no longer exists. Is that a consequence of the Blue Streak decision? Or was it always going to end this way? Blue Streak was not cancelled because it stopped working. It was cancelled because the world it was designed for changed faster than the institution that funded it could adapt. And then, when the engineers found a new role for it, the institutions that funded that role also failed to hold. The rocket outlasted 2 sets of justifications, 2 funding coalitions, 2 strategic frameworks. It was still flying reliably when the last program that contained it dissolved. What that means is this: the failure in the Blue Streak story is never the engineering. It is always the structures built around the engineering, the ministries, the committees, the white papers, the intergovernmental agreements that promised funding and then withdrew it. Those structures are not permanent. They are, as it turns out, far more fragile than a Rolls-Royce rocket engine. Close your eyes and put yourself on the Cumbrian moorland at Spadadam on a cold morning in 1958. There is nothing around you. Fell grass, bog, the faint smell of peat. And then, without warning, the RZ-2 engine test begins. It is not a sound. Before it is a sound, it is a pressure. Something that arrives through your boots and moves upward. Then it becomes the most sustained, purposeful noise you have ever heard a British machine make. It holds that note for a full minute. Then it stops, cleanly, on command. In the silence that follows, a curlew calls somewhere over the bog. The engineers mark their instruments. The engine did exactly what it was asked to do. Open your eyes. The engineers were right. The rocket worked. What failed was not the propulsion, not the guidance, not the airframe. It was the willingness of the institutions that owned it to hold their nerve long enough to understand what they had. Blue Streak is gone. The space program it could have anchored is gone with it. If you want to remember what Britain built and what Britain decided to stop building, subscribe. We are not done yet.